St. Teresa saw something that most people today still refuse to look at. She saw what happens to a soul living inside a marriage where two people share a bed, share a table, share a last name, and share absolutely nothing else. No warmth, no real conversation, no touch that means something. Just two bodies existing in the same space, going through the motions, pretending everything is fine while something invisible slowly dies between them. And she didn't just observe it from the outside. She had a way of seeing into the interior of things that made her dangerous to comfortable eyes. This is not a story about divorce. It is not a list of relationship tips. This is the story of a woman born in Avila, Spain, on March 28th, 1515, who spent 67 years on this earth and left behind a body of work so precise about the human soul that the Catholic Church made her the first woman doctor of the Church in 1970, 400 years after she died. She saw the connection between what happens in a marriage bed and what happens to a soul. She mapped it, she named it, and she warned everyone who would listen. Most people weren't listening. If you value this kind of deep spiritual history, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work, and leave a comment telling us what city you are watching from. This script is researched and factual. The primary sources are Teresa's own autobiography, written between 1562 and 1565 under obedience to her confessor, now fully available through ICS publications in the translated collected works of St. Teresa of Avila by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez. This is not a summary, this is the actual text Teresa wrote by candlelight in Avila, and the interior castle, which she began on June 2nd, 1577, and completed on November 29th of that same year, dictated in some sections because her right hand had been broken in a fall on December 24th, the year before. Now back to the story. Teresa grew up watching marriage. Her father, Don Alonso Sanchez de Tepeda, was a wool merchant, one of the wealthiest men in Avila. He married twice. His first wife, Catalina del Peso, gave him 3 children and then died. In 1509, he married Beatriz de Ahumada, Teresa's mother. Beatriz gave him 9 more children. She was also a woman who, according to Teresa's own account, used reading stories of chivalry and romance as a form of escape from the weight of her daily life. Teresa, young and watching everything, absorbed this without knowing she was absorbing it. Beatrice died in 1528, when Teresa was 13 years old. 13. A girl without a mother in 16th century Spain. A girl in a household where her father was present but emotionally distant, pious and stern, unable to bridge the gap that grief opened between them. Teresa watched her father grieve. She watched herself grieve. She watched the house go cold, not cold with cruelty, cold with absence, that particular kind of cold that comes when two people are in the same space but have stopped reaching toward each other. She already knew what that felt like. She would spend the rest of her life trying to understand it. What happens inside a person when the one closest to them becomes a stranger? Teresa did not marry. She entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation outside Avila in November 1536 at 21 years old. She later described leaving her father's house that morning as feeling like every bone in her body was being pulled apart. Not because she did not want to go, but because love, even imperfect love, even love that has gone cold and stopped speaking, costs something real when you finally walk away from it. But before the convent brought her into prayer, it brought her into years of something she described with terrifying precision. Lukewarmness, the spiritual version of sleeping in the same bed with zero intimacy. Here's the thing that most people miss about Teresa. Before she became the great mystic, the founder of 17 convents, the woman who walked the roads of Spain in sandals at 47 years old, reforming a religious order by sheer force of will, before all of that, she spent approximately 18 years in the convent oscillating between prayer and abandoning prayer. 18 years, inside a religious house, surrounded by holy things, and yet the interior life was cold. She described it in chapter 7 of her autobiography. She was going to the prayer room and coming back out again, starting and stopping, making resolutions and breaking them. She had every external condition for intimacy with God and none of the internal warmth. She called herself lukewarm. She meant something specific by that word. Not sinful in a dramatic way, not actively rejecting God, just not really there. Present in the body, absent from the center. Sound familiar? You can live with someone for 20 years like that. Church on Sunday, dinner every night, sleeping in the same bed. And the other person, or God, depending on the context, reaches toward you and finds no one home. This is what Teresa spent her life diagnosing. She recovered. The moment that pulled her out of those 18 years of interior coldness happened around 1554, when she was 39 years old. She was walking through the convent corridor and passed a statue of Jesus at the pillar during the scourging, a battered image, wounds visible, the kind of representation that was everywhere in Counter-Reformation Spain, and something in her broke open. She described it as seeing the sorely wounded Christ. She fell to her knees. She wept. and something that had been frozen began to move, it was not because the image was beautiful. It was because it was wounded. And she recognized, for the first time clearly, that she had been wounding the same relationship through years of showing up in body but not in soul. She began to write from this place of recovered warmth. And what she wrote about marriage, human marriage, the kind you enter at an altar in front of witnesses, is the kind of thing that makes people uncomfortable because it is too exact. In The Way of Perfection, written around 1565 for the nuns of St. Joseph's Convent in Avila, Teresa makes an observation that sounds almost offhand but isn't. She is talking about suffering and about the temptation to complain, and she reaches for an analogy that she clearly knows from watching the world around her. She writes, and I am paraphrasing closely from the Kavanagh translation here, that there are many married women of position who have serious complaints and great trials and yet dare not complain to their husbands for fear of annoying them. They endure a great deal of misery and have no one to relieve their minds to. When a woman has made an unhappy marriage, she does not talk about it or complain of it lest her husband know. Teresa wrote this in 1565. 5 centuries later, the silence is still the same. She wasn't being cruel about marriage. She was being honest. She was pointing to a pattern she saw everywhere in 16th century Spain. Women, and men too, who had entered a permanent covenant and found themselves locked into an interior silence. Not fighting, not dramatic, just sealed off from each other, living in parallel, the marriage real on paper, the intimacy dead in practice. And what Teresa understood, more deeply than almost anyone who has written on this subject before or since, is that this kind of cold living does something to the soul. She mapped it in The Interior Castle. The Interior Castle, 7 rooms deep, written in 1577 in Toledo, started June 2nd, set aside in July when she had to travel to Avila, resumed in September, finished November 29th. She wrote it while managing a religious reform that had enemies inside her own order, while in correspondence with King Philip II himself about the future of the Discalced Carmelites, while her right arm ached from the break she had suffered. She wrote it anyway. The image she chose for the soul is a crystal castle, transparent, lit from within, 7 sets of rooms leading from the outer wall to the center, where God lives. The outside of the castle, the surface life, is covered with what she calls reptiles and venomous creatures. This is where people live who never go inside. They are not evil. They are just outside. They have never learned to turn inward. The first mansion, the outer rooms. The soul is technically inside the castle. It is in a state of grace, but it can barely see the light from the center because it is surrounded by these crawling distractions. It hears God calling, faintly. The way you hear your spouse trying to say something from another room and you call back, just a moment, and then you forget. The second mansion. The soul begins to hear more clearly. It gets closer, but it keeps being pulled back by relationships, pleasures, business, the opinions of others, the fear of what people will think if it changes. This is the room of the person who knows something is missing in their life, in their marriage, in their soul, but cannot bring themselves to do what it takes to change it, because change is terrifying. Cold is at least familiar. The third mansion. Here is where Teresa gets uncomfortable. The third mansion is full of respectable people. People who go to church, people who do not miss obligations, people who give to charity and live orderly lives and say their prayers and have not committed any serious sin in years. They are, by every external measure, good, and they have no idea that they are stuck. Teresa says these souls are afraid of offending God, but not because they love him, because they are afraid of the consequences. There is a difference, enormous difference. A person who is faithful to their spouse because they love their spouse, and a person who is faithful because they are afraid of what will happen if they aren't, they look exactly the same from the outside. They are not the same on the inside, not even close. The third mansion is the spiritual version of a marriage that is technically intact and emotionally hollow. Correct behavior, zero warmth, everything done from duty and nothing done from love. Teresa does not congratulate these souls. She warns them. She says their love is not yet ardent enough to overwhelm their reason, meaning they are still managing their relationship with God the way you manage a business arrangement. Carefully, safely, with exits calculated. This was not what the covenant was designed for. Teresa knew what a covenant was designed for because she spent decades inside one, the covenant of her religious vows, and she knew the difference between going through the motions and actually showing up. She had done both. She was not guessing. What she found on the other side of showing up is what she tried to describe for the rest of her life. The transverberation of the heart. This is what she called the vision that became one of the most famous mystical experiences in Christian history, later sculpted by Gian Lorenzo Bernini in Rome in 1652, in a marble work that still stands in the church of Santa Maria della Vittoria. Teresa described it in chapter 29 of her autobiography. An angel with a long golden spear. The tip of the spear seemed to be on fire. The angel thrust it through her heart several times, reaching what she called her very entrails. When he withdrew it, she wrote, she felt herself burning with a great love of God. The pain was so great it made her moan. The sweetness was so overwhelming that she did not want it to stop. This is not a metaphor for something soft. This is what happens when the wall finally comes down, when the distance closes, when a relationship that has been held at arm's length for fear of being overwhelmed finally admits what it actually is. Teresa had spent years managing her relationship with God from a safe distance, present in the convent, absent from the center, and then the center came for her, and she was not ready, and it was both the most painful and the most alive she had ever felt in her life. She would spend the next 28 years trying to help other people find the same thing. Because what she understood about spiritual coldness is that it spreads. It doesn't stay contained. A soul that is cold in prayer becomes cold in love of neighbor. A marriage that is cold in the bedroom, not just physically, but in the sense of genuine presence and vulnerability, becomes cold in every other dimension too. Two people who have stopped reaching toward each other in the night eventually stop reaching toward each other at the table, in conversation, in the small daily decisions that are actually about whether you still see the other person as a person or just as furniture. Teresa watched this happen in the lives around her. In the way of perfection, she makes her analysis plain. She is talking about what she calls perfect love versus imperfect love. Perfect love, she says, wants nothing for itself. It seeks no reward. It gives without calculating return. Imperfect love, the love she watched people settle for in their marriages and in their prayer, is always keeping score, always protecting itself, always maintaining just enough distance to stay safe from real loss. Cold, safe, dead. The soul in the first three mansions of the castle is doing this with God. The married person who has retreated into silence and parallel living is doing this with their spouse. Teresa saw these as the same movement, the same closing off, the same small daily choice repeated hundreds of times to not show up, to not risk the wound that real presence might bring. She had a name for what that felt like on the receiving end. In the interior castle, describing the second dwelling place, she says the soul in this room is like a deaf mute who hears very little and resists less. It has partially lost hope of conquering. It has given up expecting to be reached. If you have been in a relationship where the other person has simply stopped trying to reach you, you know exactly what that image means. The quiet surrender, the face that stopped turning toward yours, the presence that has become an absence wearing familiar clothes. Teresa said, God waits, patiently, for years if necessary. She wrote in the interior castle that His Majesty knows well how to wait many days and years, especially when he sees perseverance and good desires. The waiting is not cold. The waiting is not indifference. The waiting is the most patient form of love, staying present to someone who has sealed themselves off, hoping they will find the courage to turn back around. What eventually moves a sealed-off soul is rarely comfort. This is the part that people don't want to hear. In the fourth mansion, the transition happens not because things get easier, but because the soul finally stops demanding that they get easier. The soul stops praying for consolations, for the warm feeling in prayer, for the emotional high that makes God feel real and close, and starts learning to be present without those feelings, to show up when it feels like nothing, to stay when staying brings no immediate reward. This is also what a real marriage requires, showing up when you feel nothing, not because the feeling is all gone and will never come back, but because feelings are not the foundation. Presence is the foundation, the choice to turn toward the other person when every surface instinct is whispering that you should turn away. Teresa described 4 stages of prayer using the image of watering a garden. The first stage, you carry water from a well by hand, hard work, slow, exhausting. You feel every step. The second stage, you use a water wheel, a little easier, a little more water for the effort. The third stage, you have built an irrigation channel from a stream. The water comes on its own with much less effort. The fourth stage, it rains. God himself waters the garden. You do not carry anything, you only receive. But, and here's what Teresa spent the most time making clear, you do not get to the rain by demanding the rain. You get to the rain by faithfully carrying your buckets from the well, year after year in the heat and the dryness and the seasons when nothing seems to be growing. You carry the water because the garden needs it, not because the carrying feels good. A marriage works the same way. There are seasons when love feels like rain, effortless, constant, received rather than earned. And there are seasons when it feels like carrying buckets from a well at the bottom of a long hill in August. The person who abandons the marriage in the bucket-carrying season never finds out whether the rain was coming. Teresa knew the bucket-carrying intimately, 18 years of it, and she came out the other side able to write one of the most precise accounts of interior transformation in the history of Western literature. In 1572, on November 18th, the historical records are specific on this date, Teresa experienced what she called the spiritual betrothal, the fifth mansion. the soul's union with God reaching a stage of such intimacy that she compared it to the moment two candles are brought close enough that their flames merge into one light. Distinct still, but one light. She was 57 years old. It had taken decades. The spiritual marriage came sometime between 1572 and 1575. The seventh mansion. Teresa's most mature description of what it means to be fully present to a relationship without reservation, without distance, without the protective shell of managed love. She described it as rain falling into a river and becoming the same water. No longer possible to separate the rain from the river. No longer possible to say where one ends and the other begins. Two wax candles can be pulled apart. Rain that has fallen into a river cannot. This is what she believed a human marriage was intended to become. Not immediately, not on the wedding day. But through the years of faithful presence, through the bucket carrying and the patience and the willingness to show up even when nothing warm is available, through the choice, made every single day, to not seal off, to not retreat into the cold where you are safe and untouchable and slowly dying. She watched too many people make the other choice. She wrote about them in the way of perfection with the kind of specificity that only comes from someone who has looked directly at the thing. She saw women enduring silently in failed marriages, unable to speak of it. She saw men who had mistaken the correct performance of obligation for the living of a life. She saw entire communities, convents included, hers included in its unreformed state, going through the motions of love with no one home inside. And she said, "This is not what you were made for." In a letter written in 1576, one of the 342 extant letters we have from her, preserved after her death on October 15th, 1582, in Alba de Tormes, she pushed back against a nun who had become too attached to a particular confessor in the way that she herself had once become too attached to relationships in the convent. The attachment was not sinful, but it was disordered. It was using another human being as a substitute for the deeper presence that only God, or only genuine vulnerability with another person, could actually provide. This is what happens in cold marriages, too. When two people stop being genuinely present to each other, they start filling the space with substitutes. Work, friends, children who are real and good but cannot carry the weight of being a replacement for a spouse. Entertainment, projects, anything that occupies the space so you don't have to feel the cold. Teresa called this settling for a lizard where you are offered a jewel. Her exact words in the interior castle were sharper. She described souls who, having been given the possibility of great treasure inside the castle, sit down on the doorstep and play with lizards. The lizards are not evil, they are just small, and playing with them is a choice, a daily, quiet, almost invisible choice to stay on the outside when you could go in. This is what zero intimacy looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not marked by any single catastrophic decision. Just the accumulation of days when the door was available and the person chose the lizard instead. The interior castle was completed on November 29th, 1577. Teresa was 62 years old. She had been reforming the Carmelite order for 15 years, founding convents from Avila to Seville, corresponding with kings and bishops in the Spanish Inquisition, traveling the roads of Spain on a wooden cart in all weather. Her body was breaking. Her health had never been strong. She had nearly died in 1538 from an illness that left her legs paralyzed for 3 years, an illness from which she recovered only after what she described as miraculous intercession of Saint Joseph. She had fallen and broken her arm in December 1576. She wrote the interior castle anyway, beginning it again in September 1577 after the summer interruption, because she believed the information mattered too much to leave unfinished. She was right. What she finished was a complete anatomy of why human beings choose cold. The answer she found was not weakness, it was fear. Specifically the fear that being fully known by God, by a spouse, by anyone, would reveal something unworthy inside. That if the wall came down, what the other person found would be insufficient. That the wound of real presence was too great a risk. This is why so many people sleep in the same bed for 30 years and never truly meet. Not because they don't want to, because they are afraid of what meeting would cost them. Teresa's answer to this fear was not a technique. It was an argument. She made it over and over in every book she wrote and every letter she sent. The argument was this: the thing you are protecting yourself from is exactly what you are dying for the lack of. The wall you have built to keep the wound out is the same wall that keeps the warmth out. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot be safe from real love and also have real love. There is no middle option. There is only the wall, or there is the open door. In the second mansion of the interior castle, she describes the person who has heard this argument and almost walked through the door and then retreated. She says, "The devil works especially hard on souls in this room, not because they are sinful, but because they are close. Closeness to real love is when the resistance comes hardest. The person who has almost opened up to their spouse, the person who has almost stopped managing their prayer life and started actually praying, the person who has one conversation, One vulnerable sentence, one act of genuine presence away from breaking the cold spell. This is exactly who the enemy of warmth and connection attacks with the most force. Because they are close, because the lizard playing can always be made to seem reasonable, the retreat can always be justified. The wall can always be reframed as dignity, as independence, as not wanting to be a burden, as realism about what relationships can actually offer. Teresa called this what it was. She had a gift for that. She also knew the specific weight of the soul that has been cold so long it has forgotten it is cold. In the third mansion, the respectable mansion, she describes a person who has not sinned dramatically, who performs all required duties, who gives to the poor and treats others fairly, and would be astonished to be told there is something missing. Because, from the inside, the third mansion feels fine. It is not painful. It is not dramatic. It is simply managed. Management is not love. Management is what you do when love has been put away for safekeeping and you are afraid to take it out again in case it has changed. She had a phrase for the goal of all her teaching. It appears at the end of the interior castle, the final chapter of the seventh mansion, where you might expect her to close with something mystical and elevated and far from ordinary life. Instead, she closes with this: the purpose of this spiritual marriage, the reason for all of it, is the birth always of good works. Not feeling, not consolation, not the extraordinary experience of a golden spear through the heart. The purpose is good works that come from a heart so fully present and so completely warm that it cannot help but overflow. A marriage that reaches that place. Two people who have stopped playing with lizards and walked through the door to each other does the same thing. It overflows into the children if there are children, into the community, into the kind of daily ordinary warmth that other people can feel in the room without being able to name it. Teresa died on October 15th, 1582, in Alba de Tormes, Castile, after weeks of illness. She had been traveling again, returning from a foundation. She was 67 years old. Her last recorded words, according to witnesses who were present, included an expression of gratitude for being a daughter of the Church. She died with the warmth she had spent her life searching for and teaching about. She was canonized in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV, 40 years after her death. In 1970, Pope Paul VI named her Doctor of the Church, the first woman to receive the title in the history of Catholicism. 485 years of silence about whether a woman's theological writing was authoritative enough, and then one sentence from Rome saying it was. She would have found that sequence both predictable and amusing. But here is the thing that should stay with you, the thing that Teresa saw more clearly than almost anyone before or since. The interior castle was not written about extraordinary people. It was not written for mystics. Teresa herself said, in the prologue to the interior castle, that she was writing for her sisters, ordinary women who had chosen the convent and were trying to live faithfully inside it. She wrote it for people who were in the middle of a life they had already committed to and were wondering why the warmth had not come yet, or had come and gone, or had never arrived the way they expected. She wrote it for people sleeping in the same bed with zero intimacy, not just with a spouse, with God, with themselves, with the life they were actually living as opposed to the life they kept meaning to start. She said the castle is always open. The door to the first mansion is always there. The light from the center never goes out. What you're waiting for is not a more favorable moment or a different version of yourself or a relationship that doesn't require the risk of being wounded. What you're waiting for is the decision to walk toward the center instead of sitting on the doorstep playing with lizards. Some people make that decision at 20, some at 62, writing by candlelight in Toledo with a broken arm. Teresa made it in a corridor in Avila in 1554 at 39 years old, on her knees in front of a battered image of a wounded Christ. And when she got up from that floor, she was not the same person who had knelt down. The records from the Convent of the Incarnation, preserved in Avila, show that by 1562 she had already begun reforming the order, already founded St. Joseph's, already begun writing the autobiography that would become one of the most widely read prose texts in Spanish history, second only to Don Quixote, 8 years. From a cold corridor to a movement that reshaped Catholic spirituality across the entire Counter-Reformation world, the corridor was always there. She just finally walked through it. And the only thing that had been waiting on the other side the whole time was everything. There is one more thing that Teresa saw, and it is the thing that most people overlook when they read her. She saw that coldness in a relationship does not arrive suddenly. It does not appear one morning like a new piece of furniture. It builds, slowly, through the accumulation of what she called small treacheries, her language in the way of perfection, the tiny daily decisions to not show up that individually mean almost nothing and collectively mean everything. A spouse who stops asking how you really are. Not rudely, just stops. One day they stopped and neither of you noticed right away. And then another day passed and another, and now asking feels strange. Feels like breaking a rule that was never written down but somehow became law anyway. A prayer life that gets pushed to the last 5 minutes of the day because other things were more urgent. One day and then another day, and then it becomes a habit of absence that feels like busyness, but is actually a choice to stay in the outer rooms of the castle. Teresa was precise about how this works because she had done it herself. 18 years of small treacheries against her own interior life. 18 years of going to the prayer room and then leaving early. Of feeling the pull toward deeper presence and deciding today was not the right day. Of finding reasons, legitimate, real reasons, the kind that always exist, to stay close to the door instead of walking through it. She did not invent this pattern. She had inherited it. Her mother, Beatrice, died at somewhere between 32 and 35 years old. The exact birth year is not in the historical record, but she married Alonso in 1509, and Teresa was born as the third child of that marriage in 1515, placing Beatrice's death in 1528 when she was likely still in her early 30s. Beatrice had used romance novels as an escape. Teresa absorbed this without judgment. She herself spent years reading novels of chivalry and later admitted it as a time of gradual cooling. The pattern passed between them without either woman being aware it was passing. This is what unexamined coldness does. It becomes the water the next generation swims in. A child raised in a house where the adults are in the same room but not with each other learns that this is what nearness looks like. They grow up and find someone to be near to. And they do what their parents did. They keep a certain distance. Not because they have decided to, because no one ever showed them the alternative. Teresa's life was the alternative, not because she had natural advantages. She was frequently ill, frequently under suspicion from the Spanish Inquisition, frequently managing crises that would break most people, but because at 39 years old she had a moment of genuine recognition and made a different choice, and then made it again the next day and the next. The interior castle, Mansion 4, describes the moment the soul stops doing only what it can do by its own effort and begins to receive what God offers. Teresa used the image of a spring filling a basin from below. The water comes up through the earth, silently without effort, from a source that the basin does not control. This is entirely different from the man carrying buckets from a well. The basin does not work for the spring. The basin only holds itself open. This is what Teresa saw as the turning point in a marriage too. Not the dramatic moment of conflict and resolution, not the anniversary speech or the couple's retreat, the small daily practice of holding yourself open to the other person, leaving the wall down, not managing the exposure, not calculating how much of yourself to offer and how much to keep protected, just staying open the way a basin stays open to whatever comes up through the earth. It is terrifying. This is the thing Teresa's critics, and she had many, including members of her own order, the Spanish Inquisition, confessors who did not believe her, bishops who tried to shut her convents, none of them could argue with. It is genuinely terrifying to be that open, to be knowable, to be present without the shell. But Teresa had walked through it herself, and she wrote with the authority of someone who had been on both sides of the wall. She had spent 18 years managing her relationship with God from the outside. She knew what that felt like. She also knew what it felt like after the wall came down in that Avila corridor in 1554. And the difference, she said, was not comparable. There is no comparison between the cold that keeps you safe and the warmth that costs you something. You can live your whole life in the cold, technically intact, morally functional, performing all required duties, going through the motions of love with someone who sleeps next to you every night. No one will arrest you for it. No one will even name it, most of the time. But something in you will know. The same way the soul in the first mansion of the castle is surrounded by light that filters down from the center and cannot quite reach where it is sitting. Not total darkness, just not the center. Just the managed distance of a person who has decided that safety is worth more than warmth. Teresa said this was the saddest possible way to live. Not the most dramatic, not the most sinful, the saddest. Because the castle is always lit from within, the door is always open. The spouse on the other side of the bed has not stopped being reachable. The warmth has not been permanently extinguished. The choice to go toward the center rather than sit on the doorstep is always, until the last breath, still available. She knew this for certain because she had made it herself at 39, after 18 years of choosing the doorstep. And in the Church of the Incarnation in Avila, the convent she entered in November 1536, the convent where she served as prioress from October 1571 to October 1574, the convent whose records still exist, there is a chair. They call it Teresa's chair. It is where she sat in choir. It is a wooden chair, worn from decades of use, not particularly impressive to look at. But the person who sat in that chair wrote in 1577 with a broken arm, in Toledo, after 30 years of interior life and 15 years of exterior reform, a description of the soul so precise that Pope Paul VI said in 1970 it belonged in the official teaching of the Universal Church. The chair is ordinary. What happened in the soul of the person who sat in it was not. And the only difference between that soul and any other soul who has ever stared at the ceiling next to someone they have stopped reaching for, the only difference, was the decision, made in a corridor in 1554, to stop playing with lizards. The convent ledgers from the Incarnation in Avila record her name in the entry for November 2nd, 1536, the day she arrived as a novice. It is written in faded ink, one name among many, Teresa de Ahumada. Nothing to suggest what was coming, nothing to suggest the woman who would reshape Catholic mysticism, found 17 convents, write 3 books that would still be read 5 centuries later, and see, with absolute clarity, the cold reality of a soul that shares a bed with someone it has stopped touching. Just a name and a date and a door she was about to walk through.